On a cold January morning in 1859 in Richmond, Virginia, a woman named Hannah stood in the auction house courtyard watching as her 5 children were brought onto the platform one by one to be sold to different buyers, who would take them to different states, separating the family permanently and ensuring that Hannah would likely never see any of them again. Hannah was 34 years old and had been enslaved her entire life. Having been born on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, and having spent her adult years working as a field hand and domestic servant while raising the 5 children she had borne between 1844 and 1856, her children were being sold because the plantation owner who had held Hannah and her family's property had died, and his estate was being liquidated to pay debts and to distribute assets among his heirs. Hannah was not being sold with her children because one of the heirs had decided to keep her for domestic work on a different property. But the children were considered more valuable if sold individually to buyers who needed specific ages and genders of workers rather than being sold as a family unit that would command lower prices. Hannah stood in that courtyard, knowing exactly what was about to happen, having been told days earlier that the sale was coming and that she would not be allowed to stay with her children, and yet she was completely powerless to prevent it, to protest, or even to say goodbye properly, because any display of resistance or grief that disrupted the sale would result in her being whipped or sold to the worst possible buyer's punishment. Before we descend into Hannah's story and into the systematic destruction of enslaved families that was one of slavery's most devastating features, hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the notification bell and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epoch of Fear, where we document the crimes that destroyed millions of families. Hannah had been born enslaved in 1825 on a tobacco plantation in rural Virginia, the daughter of a woman named Rachel, who worked in the fields and who had herself been separated from her own mother through sale when Rachel was a child. Hannah's earliest memories included her mother's stories about the grandmother Hannah had never met, stories that Rachel told partly to preserve family memory and partly to prepare Hannah for the likelihood that she too would experience family separation at some point, because such separation was universal among enslaved people and because preparing children for this trauma was one of the few things mothers could do to help them survive it. Rachel taught Hannah that loving your children meant knowing you might lose them at any moment, that the white people who owned them had absolute power to separate families and felt no moral obligation to keep families together, and that the only way to survive such losses was to accept them as inevitable rather than allowing them to destroy your will to live. These lessons were transmitted through generations of enslaved families as a form of emotional preparation for trauma that was certain to come, though no amount of preparation could truly make such trauma bearable when it actually occurred. Hannah's own experience of family separation began early when she was approximately 8 years old, and her mother Rachel was sold to a plantation owner in Georgia, leaving Hannah and her 2 siblings behind in Virginia. The sale occurred because the Virginia plantation owner needed cash to pay debts, and Rachel was at an age where she was still valuable as a worker, but was old enough that buyers preferred her without young children who would be too small to work and who would require care that reduced mothers. Productivity. Hannah remembered her mother being taken away in a wagon, remembered Rachel's last words telling her children to be strong, and to remember they were loved even when separated, and remembered the emptiness that followed as she realized that her mother was gone and would never return. Hannah was assigned to work in the plantation house doing domestic chores appropriate for a child, and she was raised thereafter by the community of enslaved adults who took responsibility for children whose parents had been sold away. A collective parenting that was necessary because family separations were so common and because enslaved communities developed systems of mutual support to help children survive losses that would otherwise have been completely devastating. By the time Hannah reached her late teens in the early 1840s, she had been sold twice more as the original plantation where she was born changed hands and as owners liquidated portions of their enslaved populations to raise capital or to settle estates. Each sale meant leaving behind the community and the relationships she had built, meant adjusting to new places and new expectations, and meant the loss of connections to people who had known her mother and who could tell her stories about her family history. Hannah understood by this point that enslaved people had no permanent homes, no guaranteed relationships, and no control over their own lives or over their children's lives if they had children. This understanding shaped how she thought about the possibility of marriage and motherhood. She wanted children and wanted family because humans naturally seek connection and love. But she knew that any family she created would be vulnerable to the same destruction that had taken her own mother from her. The decision to have children despite knowing they could be taken away was an act of both hope and courage that millions of enslaved women made, choosing to create families and to love their children fiercely, even while knowing that such love made them vulnerable to the worst pain slavery could inflict. Hannah's 5 children were born between 1844 and 1856 on the plantation of the owner, who would eventually die and whose estate sale would result in the family separation. The children's father was another enslaved man named Joseph, who worked in the plantation stables, and Hannah and Joseph had maintained what enslaved people called a marriage, even though such marriages had no legal standing and could be dissolved at any moment by owners who could sell either partner away. Hannah had hoped that having been on the same plantation for over 15 years, without being sold, might mean that the owner recognized some value in keeping families together, and she had allowed herself to believe that perhaps her children might grow up together and might even maintain contact with her as adults. But this hope was always tempered by the knowledge that owners' economic interests always took precedence over enslaved people's family bonds, and that any crisis requiring liquidation of assets would mean families being separated, regardless of how long they had been together. When the owner died in late 1858 and the estate entered probate, Hannah knew immediately that her family was at risk because estate settlements routinely involved selling enslaved people to convert them to cash that could be distributed among heirs or used to pay creditors. The process that led to Hannah's children being sold began in December 1858 when the estate's executors inventoried all property, including the enslaved people, who would be divided among heirs or sold to satisfy debts. Hannah, Joseph, and their 5 children were appraised for their market values based on their ages, physical conditions, skills, and potential as workers. The children ranged from 3-year-old Sarah to 15-year-old Thomas, with 3 daughters and 2 sons between those ages. Each child was assigned a separate value rather than the family being valued as a unit, because enslaved people were treated as individual assets whose values were determined by market demand for specific types of workers rather than as family units, whose value might include the stability and productivity that came from keeping families together. The appraisal process itself was traumatic, as enslaved people were examined like livestock, their physical characteristics documented, their teeth checked, their muscles assessed, all while appraisers discussed their values and their optimal buyers as though they were merchandise rather than human beings with thoughts, feelings, and family bonds. The decision about what would happen to Hannah's family was made by the heirs and executors, based entirely on their own interests with no consideration given to the family's wishes or to keeping them together. One heir wanted to keep Hannah for domestic work at a property she owned, and she claimed Hannah as part of her inheritance share. But this heir did not want Joseph or any of the children, either because she had no use for them or because she preferred the flexibility of selling them to realize immediate cash value. Another heir claimed Joseph as part of his share, intending to take him to a different plantation where he would work in stables. And the 5 children were designated to be sold at auction to whoever would pay the highest prices, maximizing the estate's value and ensuring that each heir received their full portion. The fact that this plan would permanently separate a family that had been together for 15 years did not factor into anyone's decision-making, because enslaved people's family bonds were not recognized as having any value or importance compared to the economic interests of white owners. Hannah learned about the planned sale in early January 1859, when the heir who was claiming her informed her that she would be moving to a new property, but that her husband and children would not be coming with her. Hannah begged to be allowed to stay with her children, or to be sold with them so the family could remain together, explaining that separating her from her children would be devastating and offering to work without complaint at whatever tasks were required if only the family could stay together. But her pleas were dismissed as irrelevant emotional displays that had no bearing on business decisions that were already made. Hannah was told that she should be grateful that she was being kept rather than being sold to unknown buyers, that her children would be going to good homes where they would be well treated, and that she needed to accept what was happening rather than making trouble by complaining about things she could not change. These responses reflected the fundamental dehumanization of slavery that allowed white people to destroy families while convincing themselves that they were being benevolent and that enslaved people's grief was either not genuine or was less important than it would be if white families were being separated. The sale took place on January 15th, 1859, at a Richmond auction house that specialized in selling enslaved people and that conducted such sales multiple times per week as part of Virginia's extensive domestic slave trade. Hannah was brought to the auction against her will, specifically to witness the sale of her children, a practice that was common because owners believed that having mothers present during sales of their children made the transactions more legitimate and demonstrated that mothers accepted the separations. In reality, forcing mothers to watch their children being sold was a form of torture that maximized trauma, while ensuring mothers could not disrupt sales or create sympathy for families being destroyed. Hannah stood in the auction house courtyard with dozens of other enslaved people who were being sold that day, watching as the auction proceeded with various enslaved adults and children being brought onto the platform, examined by potential buyers, and sold to whoever bid highest. When her oldest son Thomas was brought onto the platform, Hannah had to watch as the auctioneer described his physical characteristics and his value as a field worker, as buyers examined him and discussed his merits as property, and as he was sold to a man from Alabama who would take Thomas hundreds of miles away from Virginia. The process repeated 4 more times as each of Hannah's other children was brought onto the platform and sold to different buyers. 14-year-old Rebecca was sold to a plantation owner from Mississippi. 11-year-old Samuel was sold to a different buyer heading to Louisiana. 8-year-old Martha was sold to a buyer from North Carolina. And 3-year-old Sarah, the youngest, was sold to a woman from South Carolina who wanted a young child she could train for domestic work. None of the children were sold to buyers from the same state or to buyers who knew each other or had any connection that might allow the siblings to maintain contact. Each sale was final and irrevocable, with buyers paying cash and receiving bills of sale that transferred ownership and that gave them absolute authority over the children they had purchased. Throughout the entire process, which took approximately 3 hours as the auction moved through various enslaved people being sold that day, Hannah was required to stand silently and to show no resistance or disruption that might interfere with sales or that might make buyers uncomfortable about purchasing children from a mother who objected. Any attempt to protest or to physically reach for her children would have resulted in immediate violent punishment and would have made no difference to the outcome, since the sales would proceed regardless of her resistance. The enforcement of Hannah's silence during her children's sale demonstrates the absolute power that slavery gave to white people over enslaved people's bodies, voices, and emotions. Hannah was not just physically prevented from interfering with the sale, she was also prevented from expressing her grief, from saying proper goodbyes to her children, or from making any statements that might create sympathy or moral discomfort for the buyers and sellers who were destroying her family. Guards and overseers were positioned throughout the auction house, specifically to watch enslaved people being sold, and to ensure that any signs of resistance were immediately suppressed through threats or violence. The cultural norms of slave sales included expectations that enslaved people would submit quietly to being sold, and that any displays of grief or resistance were inappropriate disruptions that demonstrated enslaved people's savagery and inability to control their emotions. These norms served to make the violence of family separation appear normal and acceptable, to allow buyers and sellers to participate in destroying families without having to confront the human cost of what they were doing, and to blame enslaved people themselves for any trauma they displayed rather than recognizing that trauma as evidence of slavery's fundamental evil. The aftermath of the sale saw Hannah being taken to her new owner's property while her husband Joseph was taken to a different location, and while her 5 children were transported in various directions by their new owners. Hannah would never see any of her children again, would never know what happened to them after they left Richmond that day, would never know if they survived or if they remained enslaved until the Civil War ended slavery, or if they died young from the brutal conditions that characterized slavery throughout the South. Joseph likewise disappeared from Hannah's life permanently, taken to a plantation where he would work until his own eventual death from causes Hannah would never learn. The severing of these family bonds was absolute and was intended to be so. Buyers specifically preferred purchasing enslaved people who would be taken far from their previous homes because distance made escape attempts less likely and made it impossible for family members to maintain contact or to plan reunions. The domestic slave trade that destroyed Hannah's family operated on a massive scale, with hundreds of thousands of enslaved people being sold annually in the decades before the Civil War, moving primarily from the upper South states, like Virginia, to the deep South states, where cotton and sugar cultivation demanded constant supplies of new workers to replace those who died from the brutal labor regimes. Hannah's experience in the years following the sale of her children was characterized by grief, trauma, and the struggle to find meaning in continued existence after losing everything that had made her life worth living. Enslaved people who lost children to sale commonly experienced what modern medicine would recognize as clinical depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and complex grief that was complicated by the fact that lost family members might still be alive somewhere but were completely inaccessible. Hannah went through periods of being unable to eat or sleep, of crying uncontrollably when she thought no one was watching, of being unable to concentrate on work tasks, and of contemplating suicide as a way to escape suffering that seemed unbearable. But she also found ways to survive through the support of other enslaved people who had experienced similar losses. Through faith in Christian teachings that promised eventual reunion in heaven, even if earthly reunion was impossible, and through the simple human resilience that allowed people to continue living even after experiencing trauma that should have destroyed them. The fact that millions of enslaved people survived the destruction of their families and found ways to create new connections and new sources of meaning demonstrates both the human capacity for resilience and the ongoing psychological damage that slavery inflicted on people who were forced to endure losses that no one should ever have to endure. The broader context of family separation under slavery reveals that Hannah's experience, while individually traumatic, was not unusual, but was part of systematic practices that destroyed families as a matter of routine economic calculation. Historians estimate that approximately 1/3 of enslaved families in the Upper South were separated by sale during the decades before the Civil War, with children being particularly likely to be sold away from parents once they reached ages where they were valuable as workers. The domestic slave trade that facilitated these separations moved approximately 1 million enslaved people from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1790 and 1860, forcibly relocating people on a scale that constituted one of the largest forced migrations in human history. This trade was motivated by the economic reality that the Upper South was shifting away from tobacco and toward mixed farming that required fewer workers, while the Deep South's cotton boom created insatiable demand for labor that could only be satisfied through purchasing enslaved people from states that had surpluses. The human cost of these economic forces was the destruction of hundreds of thousands of families, including Hannah's, destruction that was acknowledged by slaveholders and slave traders, but that was justified as necessary for economic progress and as acceptable, because enslaved people were property whose family bonds had no legal protection or moral significance. The legal framework that enabled Hannah's children to be sold away from her was based on the principle that enslaved people were chattel property rather than persons with rights, and that owners' property rights took absolute precedence over any claims enslaved people might make to family relationships or to protection from separation. Some states had laws that nominally prohibited selling young children away from mothers, usually defining young children as those under age 10. But these laws were rarely enforced and were easily evaded by owners who wanted to maximize their property values by selling children individually. There were no laws prohibiting the sale of older children away from parents, no laws requiring that siblings be kept together, and no laws giving enslaved people any voice or any legal standing to challenge sales or to petition for families to be reunited. The legal system treated enslaved families as having no more moral or legal significance than groupings of livestock, and judges consistently ruled that owners had absolute discretion to separate families whenever economic interests dictated such separation. This legal framework meant that the destruction of Hannah's family was not a crime, was not even technically a wrong that could be remedied through law, but was simply an exercise of property rights that was completely within the owner's legal authority, however morally reprehensible it might have been. The psychological impact on children who were sold away from their mothers was severe and lasting, affecting their development, their ability to form attachments, and their fundamental sense of security and identity. Children who experienced such separation often spent their entire lives searching for family members they had been separated from, maintaining hope that somehow they might be reunited even when the likelihood was vanishingly small. The trauma of separation influenced how formerly enslaved people raised their own children after emancipation, with many being overprotective or struggling to balance the desire to keep families close with the recognition that children needed independence to build their own lives. The intergenerational transmission of this trauma affected families for generations after slavery ended, with descendants carrying stories about ancestors who had been separated and never reunited, stories that became part of family histories, and they shaped how families understood their own identities and histories. The fact that so many African American families cannot trace their ancestry beyond a certain point because of records destroyed by slavery and because of families separated by sale is a direct legacy of practices that destroyed Hannah's family and millions of others. The testimony of formerly enslaved people recorded in the 1930s through Federal Writers Project interviews included numerous accounts of family separations and of the lasting trauma such separations caused. These interviews documented how elderly people in their 80s and 90s still grieved for parents and siblings and children. They had been separated from 60 or 70 years earlier, still remembered the specific details of sales and of last moments together, and still hoped against reason that somehow family members might still be alive and might be found. The emotional weight of these testimonies provides evidence that contradicts pro-slavery apologists who claim that enslaved people did not form strong family bonds, or that they recovered quickly from separations. The testimony demonstrates that enslaved people's family bonds were as strong as anyone's family bonds. That separation was devastating trauma rather than minor inconvenience, and that the psychological damage was permanent even when people found ways to survive and to create new lives. Hannah's story represents millions of such stories that were lived but that were never documented, because enslaved people had no means to record their experiences, and because their grief was deliberately ignored or minimized by white society that did not want to acknowledge the human cost of the profits slavery generated. The question of whether anything could have prevented Hannah's family from being separated requires acknowledging both the structural factors that made such separation systematic and the specific choices that individuals made that could have been different. Structurally, slavery was an economic system that treated people as property and that required treating family bonds as less important than property values, which meant that family separations were inevitable consequences of the system's fundamental logic. No reform of slavery could have eliminated family separations without undermining the system's basic functioning, because the ability to buy and sell enslaved people was essential to how slavery operated as an economic institution. But within that structural reality, individual owners made choices about whether to keep families together when such choices were economically feasible, and the executors of the estate that owned Hannah's family chose to maximize cash value rather than making any effort to keep the family together or to find a single buyer who would purchase them as a unit. These choices were shaped by the values and priorities that Slavery cultivated, including the complete prioritization of white economic interests over black humanity, the normalization of violence and trauma as acceptable costs of doing business, and the development of elaborate ideological justifications that portrayed such actions as acceptable or even beneficial. The resistance that enslaved people engaged in against family separations took multiple forms, ranging from open defiance to subtle subversion to documentation that preserved family memories despite owners' attempts to erase them. Some enslaved people physically resisted sales by refusing to cooperate with examinations or auctions, though such resistance usually resulted in brutal punishment and in the sales proceeding anyway. Some attempted to escape with their families before sales could occur, though the difficulty of traveling with children made such escapes extremely difficult and usually unsuccessful. Some negotiated with owners for permission to visit family members who had been sold to other locations, sometimes being granted such permission and sometimes maintaining family contact through letters written by literate friends when enslaved people themselves were not allowed to read or write. And many preserved family stories and family identities through oral tradition that kept knowledge of separated relatives alive across generations, enabling post-emancipation reunification efforts and ensuring that family bonds endured in memory, even when physical contact was impossible. These forms of resistance did not prevent Hannah's family from being separated, and did not save the millions of other families that were destroyed, but they demonstrated enslaved people's refusal to accept the dehumanization that slavery attempted to impose and their determination to maintain family connections despite all obstacles. Hannah's ultimate fate after her children were sold is not well documented because she became one of millions of formerly enslaved people whose individual stories were lost when documentation focused on white people's experiences rather than on the experiences of the people who had been enslaved. Hannah probably remained enslaved until the Civil War ended slavery in 1865, when she would have been 40 years old. Like millions of other formerly enslaved people, she probably spent the years immediately after emancipation searching for family members, including her children and her husband Joseph, using the networks and resources that were available through Freedmen's Bureau and through black churches and through newspaper advertisements seeking information about lost relatives. Whether she ever found any of her children is unknown, though the statistical likelihood is that she did not, because the difficulties of locating people who had been sold to different states and who had no means of communicating their locations were nearly insurmountable. Hannah probably died sometime in the late 19th or early 20th century, having lived most of her life with the grief of having watched her children being sold and having been powerless to prevent it or to ever see them again. What should we remember about Hannah's story and about the millions of enslaved mothers who watched their children being sold and could say nothing to stop it? That family separation was not an unfortunate side effect of slavery, but was a deliberate and systematic practice that was essential to how slavery functioned economically, and that was intended to break enslaved people's spirits and to prevent family bonds from creating solidarity that might enable resistance. That approximately 1 million enslaved people were forcibly relocated through the domestic slave trade in the decades before the Civil War, destroying hundreds of thousands of families in the process. That mothers like Hannah were forced to watch their children being sold while being prohibited from protesting or resisting, or even properly saying goodbye, because any such displays would disrupt sales and would make white buyers and sellers uncomfortable. that children were sold individually to maximize their value rather than being sold with families, ensuring that siblings were separated and that family reunification was nearly impossible, that the legal system provided no protection against family separation and treated enslaved people's family bonds as having no significance compared to owners' property rights, that the trauma of separation was lasting and was transmitted across generations, affecting how formerly enslaved people and their descendants understood family and identity, and that the fact that so many African American families cannot trace their ancestry or find records of ancestors is a direct result of slavery's systematic destruction of families and of records. What do you think about the fact that slavery allowed mothers like Hannah to be forced to watch their children being sold while being prohibited from saying or doing anything to prevent it? How should we understand the psychological trauma of such experiences? And how should that trauma be acknowledged in contemporary discussions about slavery's legacy? What does the systematic separation of families reveal about slavery's fundamental evil and about the moral bankruptcy of a society that allowed such practices? And what responsibility do we have to remember and honor the millions of mothers and children whose families were destroyed by slavery, even when their individual names and stories are lost to history? Leave your thoughts below. If Hannah's story of being forced to watch her children sold and being powerless to prevent it challenged your understanding of slavery's violence and demonstrated the systematic destruction of families that characterized the institution, hit subscribe for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We document the crimes that destroyed millions of families, and we assure that victims whose names are lost are still honored and remembered. Share this with someone who needs to understand that family separation was not incidental to slavery, but was deliberate policy, designed to maximize profits while destroying the family bonds that gave enslaved people's lives meaning. Hannah watched her children sold. She could say nothing, but we can say everything. Remember her. Remember them all.